Our third speaker today is an educator whose particular area of expertise is global studies and global programs, and what it really means for an individual school to commit to the idea of integrating global awareness into every aspect of the school's curricular and co-curricular activities. There's a balance between preparing students and shaping schools, and probably one of the most significant accomplishments of a successful program is cultivating ways of thinking and the habits of heart and mind that encourage an entire community to think outside of themselves. I'm honored to introduce to you the Director of Global Studies from St. Andrew's Episcopal School, Chris Harth.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you, Steve, Lori, SAIS staff. Thank you, Jay and Nishant, for sharing your personal journey and for the narrative about your lives in the Asheville School and how it's changed not only your lives and the school communities, but how it really sets an example for all of us as we look at the world, think about our opportunities, and step into the second eighth of the 21st century, Steve noted earlier. I'm excited to be standing here before you today, and as a social scientist and former policy analyst, I'm going to take a very different tact in my remarks. I am, though, both a product and a beneficiary of such international schooling, learning about security and insecurity from Poles, Germans, and Russians who fought each other last century, and from about cultural differences in East Asia from Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese. I would not be the same person, nor would I have the same nuanced worldview without those international experiences, which leaves aside for the moment the transformative nature of my travel and the hosting of international guests, which are an integral part of what I do at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Mississippi. Rather than relay my own narrative or more detailed information about what we're doing at St. Andrew's, which I'm happy to do in other contexts, I'm mindful that I now stand between you, a beverage, dinner, and the fourth game of the World Series. And while I will endeavor to be brief and not obstructionist, today my role is to make the case for the global imperative, or as I would prefer to say, the glocal imperative. The short version is that our current world is very different than from the one in which we grew up. As you heard in Steve's remarks at lunch, the future is likely to be even more different, with greater change and at a higher rate. As educators and school leaders, we have a responsibility to adapt our educational approaches to fit these emergent conditions and to prepare our students for their futures, not for our past, nor even for their present. Moreover, as school leaders in the South, we have an extraordinary opportunity to set an example of how well it can and should be done. As someone who has spent the last 7 years in Mississippi, a definitively Southern state, I have come to embrace its manifest power of place, which has helped redefine global for me as glocal. As we have moved forward at St. Andrews and made demonstrable headway with programs connecting our local and global communities, we have seen others take note of what we are accomplishing, at least in part because of where we are doing it and because of their expectations about Mississippi, as accurate or inaccurate as those expectations might be. In this regard, we have not only an obligation to realize this glocal imperative for our students, schools, communities, region, nation, and world, the multiple levels that constitute this glocal framework, but also an opportunity to model best practices and to help others do the same. Let's now flesh out this argument, looking first at this glocal notion, then at some of the key drivers and changes shaping our world, which Steve touched on today in his remarks, and then at some of the steps that educators and schools can and should take to adapt to these emergent conditions and best prepare young people to survive, succeed, and lead and most importantly, to live well together on our small planet. Among the iconic images for this glocal notion are nesting dolls, which reflect the idea of nested identities and nested communities. If we view the smallest doll as an individual, like ourselves, that doll lives in a locality, like Jackson or Atlanta. That locality is situated in a state, like Mississippi or Georgia. Our states are situated or nested within the South, which in turn is situated in the United States, which in turn is situated on Earth, our shared home. This notion of multiple nested or layered communities is also reflected in this second grader's artwork, which is an easy way to have even our youngest students appreciate their connection to multiple embedded communities. It also is reflected in the multiple complementary flags that one sees flying around the world, in Europe in particular, with the three pictured here representing Rome, Italy, and the European Union. Complicating matters when one asks someone in Rome, as we're often asked in Mississippi, where are you from? Are they Roman? Are they Italian? Are they European? Or some combination thereof? The underlying mechanism that generates this glocal dynamic is the interaction of the twin forces of globalization and localization. More specifically, like local micro-agents interact repeatedly with each other and generate macro-global structures and trends. Every global phenomena has local roots. At the same time, every global trend or phenomena, as universal and appealing as it may seem, including ideas like global education, has to be interpreted and applied in local contexts. In the diagram, you may notice that there are no starting or ending points. Rather, the local and global flows are continuous, generating emergent glocal outcomes that are best described as in a constant state of becoming. These twin forces of globalization and localization are described in detail by Thomas Friedman, a multiple Pulitzer Prize-winning author, in his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. Sold in more than 80 countries, and with parts from nearly as many, the Lexus represents the integrative forces of globalization. This one actually represents a little bit of privilege as well, as it's parked in a handicapped spot up on the sidewalk. The olive tree, in contrast, with its deep roots and long life, represents the forces of localization, particularly the power of tradition and place. In that work, Friedman uses the term glocalization to convey how global commerce must be applied in local contexts. Missing from that interpretation is the flip side of glocalization, with all of the local interactions generating global phenomena, which do not simply emerge from thin air. Walmart, for example, grew up in Arkansas, not in Kunming. And Coca-Cola was born right here in Atlanta, although it's found around the world. Last summer's feature article in Time magazine came closer to recognizing these interactions and two-way causal flows between the local and the global, while still emphasizing the needs to adapt global trends to local marketplaces. Perhaps no one does this better than McDonald's, with over 34,000 restaurants in 119 countries. Consider, for example, the McCafe model, found across Europe, and suited to those preferring a leisurely cup of coffee or croissant, while conversing in comfortable setting with free newspapers, attractive shrubbery, and a lovely ambiance. Consider as well the tailored menu that McDonald's offers all over the world, from a German sausage fried chicken sandwich in Japan, to vegetarian options in India, to the spinach and Parmesan croquettes and fried brie cheese bits that you might find at the Termini train station in Rome. In addition to this glocal dynamic, at least 4 other drivers are shaping our world: environmental changes, economic changes, demographic changes, and technological changes, leading Friedman and others to characterize our world as hot, flat, crowded, and connected. Hopefully something that we can all leave here with. Perhaps the most powerful driver, at least one of the most powerful, concern demographics and the demographic changes underway on both national and global levels. On a global level, it took tens of thousands of years for us to reach the first billion people in the 1800s. It took approximately 135 years to reach the second billion. It took approximately 35 to reach the next, which happened around the time that I was born. From that time until I graduated from high school, the population of the planet increased by 50%, from 3 billion to 4.5 billion. By the year 2000, around the time our current 8th graders were born, the population had increased by another 1.5 billion people to roughly 6 billion. In the last 13 years, this century, we've added yet another billion to roughly a little over 7 billion people on Earth now. Current population projections have us adding another billion by the year 2030, and yet another billion for a total of 9 billion by the year 2050, when our current students will be our age. Moreover, this population growth has been taking place in less developed countries. Those with less are having more children. At the same time, the population of the more developed countries has remained constant, shifting from approximately 1/3 of the world's population in 1950 to approximately 1/9 in 2050. As Steve noted earlier, these dramatic population increases are having profound impacts on global demand for food, water, and energy, with at least half of the world's population projected to live in water-distressed areas by the year 2030. The population of the United States also is projected to increase over the next 40 years by roughly 1/3, from 300 million to 400 million, with much of the growth occurring in immigrant and non-white families. Current projections by the US Census have our country shifting from a white majority to a non-majority demographic, which has important implications for how our students need to understand themselves, their communities, and people from different backgrounds and cultures. A second set of changes concerns economics and the so-called flattening of our world. The distribution of wealth, as measured by national output, is shifting. Of the 17 countries that produced over $1 trillion in output in 2012, the majority were non-Western. Only the United States and Germany were in the top 7. These shifts in economic production and wealth will be mirrored in changing patterns of global consumption, again a topic that Steve addressed earlier today. With India and China's growing middle class, there in the blue on the bottom, each with more people than there are people in the United States overall, projected to account for over 50% of global consumption by the year 2050. The flip side of this flattening, which is why I say the so-called flattening, because it's another side of this, is increased polarization and a more skewed distribution of wealth, both nationally and globally. One common measure of income inequality is the Gini coefficient, which measures distribution of income by quintile. The higher the coefficient, the more concentrated the wealth. The global coefficient has been increasing over the last 200 years, with the top 1% in the United States now controlling approximately 20% of the income, the most skewed distribution among developed Western democracies. Over the last 20 years, the coefficient has increased in the United States as well, reflecting a widening of the income gap between the rich and the poor. These gaps, however, are not uniformly distributed. The largest concentration of the most skewed counties in the United States is found right here in the Southeast. Again, with important educational implications for how we need to prepare our students to work collaboratively with neighbors from different backgrounds and cultures. A third set of changes and challenges concern the environment. The array of indices pointing toward climate change are no longer debatable. Whether one looks at surface temperature, ocean temperature, snow cover, sea ice, disappearing glaciers, or increased carbon dioxide, the indices all point in the same direction. Our climate is changing. 2012 was the hottest year on record for the United States, and the second most extreme. Globally, it was the 10th warmest overall since we started keeping records in the late 1800s. All 12 years this century have been among the 14 warmest years in recorded history. With more energy in our global ecosystem, the sight of storm fronts 1,000 miles long may no longer be an anomaly, but a new norm. Perhaps most troubling are the feedback loops in our environment that have forced the revision of forecasts for the next century, and that project dramatic and potentially catastrophic, game-changing increases in temperatures around the globe. Not usually known for their environmental advocacy, the World Bank is taking this threat seriously, as it may undermine developmental projects currently underway and those planned for the future. Their recent projections, pictured in the slide above, have some areas increasing in temperature by 10 degrees Celsius, about 18 degrees Fahrenheit, which could render them uninhabitable and have serious consequences for how we organize ourselves socially, economically, and politically, especially if the increased temperatures in the north melt the permafrost and release stores of methane, which is roughly 20 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. A fourth set of changes concerns technology and the various tools that are bringing our world closer together. Here, too, the trends are unmistakable. Over the last decade, international air travel has nearly doubled. Over the last 30 years, international trade has increased by a factor of 7, from $3 trillion to over $20 trillion, with international investments following a similar pattern of growth, save for the dips after 9/11 and our recent global recession. Perhaps most powerful have been the recent advances in communication. Mobile cell phones are leading the way, with nearly as many mobile phone subscriptions, the light blue band, as there are people on Earth. And with mobile broadband subscriptions, hotspots quickly gaining ground and surpassing fixed broadband and wired phone lines. How many of you still have a wired line at your house? How many of you have a smartphone? How many of you have rules at your schools to prohibit or restrict their use by students? Capitalizing on this increased connectivity, the power of social networking also has continued to grow. Facebook, for example, grew from approximately 200 million users in 2009 to over 1 billion users by the end of last year, making the number of connected users only slightly smaller than the number of people in China or India. And with an extensive web of interactions spanning the globe. Notice the concentration of users. In this respect, it's interesting that these interactions are affected by place and not necessarily in ways that we might expect. While technology has helped bridge distance and made previously faraway lands and peoples more accessible, the data indicate that we are using this technology to communicate more with people who are close to us. However, if you don't already use Facebook, not to worry. Last week, as I debriefed with a group of our 8th grade class that had traveled to the Heifer Global Village outside of Little Rock for an overnight expedition, I asked how many of them were using Facebook. Of the 100, only 5 raised their hands. When I asked how many of them were on Instagram, all but 3 raised their hands. Taken together, these changes are reshaping our planet, necessitating a new approach to education that centers on the cultivation of global or glocal literacies and competencies, as the Asia Society, one of the leaders in the field of global education, concluded in 2009. So, how are we doing? In 2009, a survey conducted in that same year, conducted by NIS, revealed that roughly 2/3 of NIS member schools were doing something global, including travel programs, Challenge 2020, international partnerships, and the like. Over the last 4 years, independent schools across the nation have made considerable headway. In 2013, 95% of the 1,500 schools surveyed have some form of global education program in place. While the data for our region are not as conclusive, there are both bright spots and plenty of room for growth. So how can our schools move forward? We can identify 3 broad areas: curricular, programmatic or co-curricular, and institutional. In terms of potential curricular steps, the 2 easiest ways to make progress are to address glocal topics, global or local, or to address any topic from multiple perspectives. One can bring an array of resources into the classroom with experts, people who've traveled to other countries, and people who are currently living in other places with technology. Of course, we can also add new classes, addressing local or global topics, all with an emphasis on real-world issues, data, and applicability. Perhaps most exciting is the ease associated with new collaborative international online learning opportunities, COIL, that allow us to take existing curricular units and simply to connect with somebody else at another school doing the same thing, sharing information and perspectives. To be more concrete in this curricular realm, it may be helpful to think about what students need to know and be able to do. In my recent work with the College Board and their Global Education Committee, we focused on knowledge, on key knowledge and skills, and then added a 3rd category, attitudes or dispositions. Some would call them perspectives. We then flipped this trifecta on its head. Given that we now carry information at our fingertips, the importance of skills and attitudes has increased. In terms of key glocal knowledge, students need to understand the world and how it works. They should have a firm grounding in the geography and history of our world, which of course includes the United States, which should be studied in a larger global context, not in a vacuum. As young citizens, they also should study economics and government, also in a global context, as well as world art, literatures, cultures, and belief systems. They should be able to communicate in at least 2 modern world languages. They also should understand complex systems and global ecology. In terms of glocal skills, the emphasis should be on identifying and prioritizing issues that matter, posing questions, and finding, analyzing, sharing, and applying information, particularly about those issues that matter most. To survive, succeed, and lead, young people need to be able to communicate and to collaborate effectively with people from different backgrounds and cultures, to work together to solve the common problems we face. Arguably even more important are the attitudes and dispositions that will drive young people to wrestle with and creatively solve these problems, such as inquisitiveness, open-mindedness, and the willingness to step out of one's comfort zone. They need to be flexible, adaptable, and resilient, because if there is one constant in our world, it is change. Ultimately, we want to prepare students to make a difference in our world and to make positive contributions to multiple communities. We want them to believe in their capacity to make a difference. Ideally, by having them do that while they're under our care and before they leave our schools, so that they leave not just educated and equipped, but experienced, confident, and self-directed. Cultivating such literacies and competencies is one of the principal purposes of experiential learning programs. Learning can and does take place both in and out of the classroom, with real-world experiences often more memorable and transformative than even the most brilliant classroom lessons. The challenge, of course, is to balance our meaningful academic offerings with meaningful experiences, both for our students and our faculty. In many of our schools, we are already doing this work. We are doing it with diversity, we are doing it with sustainability, we are doing it with service learning. Broadly defined, glocal education encompasses all of these and more, and can serve as a natural complement to the efforts already underway in our schools. Not to be neglected, of course, are the experiential learning opportunities associated with travel, exchanges, and partnerships with neighbors near and far, which can be integrated, as we have done at St. Andrews, into service learning programs involving collaborative and reciprocal service. All of these can help us realize our public purpose in multiple communities. Complementing these programmatic and curricular steps should be institutional steps that help schools create firm foundations for the success of these endeavors. Perhaps most important initially is the commitment of personnel and resources. The importance of having someone responsible for leading the effort, as well as a high quality and diverse faculty, cannot be overestimated. Ample financial resources and dedicated space for curricular and programmatic activities are essential, as is having some clear mission and sense of purpose to guide these activities. Over time, and as part of a natural strategic planning and reaccreditation process, schools should formalize and institutionalize this commitment by weaving it into the fabric of their mission statements and by crafting viable fundraising strategies that will support these efforts over time. To be clear, our schools are not broken. In fact, they are among the best in the nation and continue to improve. But the world is changing more and faster than ever before. These changes are at the heart of the glocal imperative. They require us to think anew about our world, about the needs of our students, and about how we can best prepare them for their futures. In this respect, we have both a moral obligation and a practical interest in making the next generation of leaders properly equipped and prepared to address the daunting transnational issues we face. Moreover, in doing so here in the South, where the issues are at least as complex and demanding as any place in the United States, we also have an opportunity to set a powerful and positive example. So while the founders of our country may have believed in the power of oceanic moats to insulate us from the vagaries of our world, our context is different. We are not an island unto ourselves. And our students will not benefit from living in a bubble. We need to engage them and the world, to prepare them to step into it confidently and with a sense of purpose to make positive contributions to multiple communities, local through global. Ultimately, we are responsible for preparing the next generation of leaders to take us into a reality and to craft a reality that allows all of us to live well together on our small planet. Thank you.